Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Paul Pierson, who holds the Avis Saint Chair in Public Policy in the Department of Political Science at UC Berkeley. His publications include Dismantling the Welfare State, The Politics of Retrenchment in Britain and the United States, Politics and Time, History, Institutions, and Social Analysis, and most recently, Off-Center, The Republican Revolution and the Erosion of American Democracy, which he co-authored with Jacob S. Hacker. Paul, thanks for coming to our program.
Thanks for having me on, Harry.
Where were you born and raised?
I was raised in Eugene, Oregon, so just up the coast a little bit.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Well, profoundly. I mean, I grew up in a university town. Both my parents taught at the University of Oregon. My mother was an English teacher, taught Shakespeare, and my father taught European history. And it was also a strongly religious family. My mother eventually became a minister. And so both in terms of the life of the mind, intellectual life, but also a set of values that they thought should carry you through life and be reflected in your work. That was an important part of my growing up.
And what was it just inevitable that you would get interested in these political issues that have a that are embedded in a historical context which you try to analyze?
Well, I guess if you look from where I am now, it's pretty easy to connect the dots, but I don't think it was as obvious coming at it from the other direction. Most of the time when I was growing up, I didn't think that I was going to become an academic. I sort of thought of that as a pointy-headed activity that my father engaged in. I think to the extent that I thought about things like that, I thought I would probably be a lawyer or maybe be involved in politics, because I've always had that interest in politics. But it wasn't actually until I was in my collegiate years that I started to think about intellectual life as something other than what my father did.
Mm-hmm. And where did you do your undergraduate work?
Oberlin College in Ohio.
And what did you major in there?
Political science. They call it government.
And then any teachers there that really influenced your thinking about the world?
Well, so one of the reasons I ended up there was because it had such a great reputation for teaching, and I continue to have a real affection and admiration for a school that's as devoted to the teaching of undergraduates as a school like that can be. And there was actually the teacher I worked with most closely there was UC Berkeley PhD Harlan Wilson, who taught political philosophy. Mm-hmm.
And then on to graduate school. Where did you do your graduate work?
At Yale.
Mm-hmm. And there, any faculty that particularly influenced the directions that your dissertation finally took?
Well, they had an incredible set of faculty there. It was at that point still one of the best departments in the country. And actually, there's this very strong Berkeley Yale connection. A number of Berkeley's most renowned political scientists trained at Yale. Robert Dahl and Charles Lindblom were leading figures in that department when I was there, and they had a big effect on me.
Mm-hmm. Now your main focus, I think we can say, is comparative politics. And first thing I want to ask you is what is the temperament, the skills required to do comparative politics, the study of comparative politics?
Well, I think you need to have a curiosity about other places and the patience to try to really learn in a deep way about them. And I think one thing about doing comparative politics, what's been interesting to me in my own the evolution of my own work is that I started doing comparative politics, but it was always a way for me of trying to get a better sense of the United States. I feel like it's hard to understand the situation that you're living in unless you have some kind of perspective to put it in. And one of the things I loved about comparative politics was that it encouraged you to look at a whole society, to think about how a society was put together, the different elements of it, and what they added up to. Whereas if you only are focused on your own society, there's a tendency to break it down into little pieces and only study those little pieces, which would be one of my concerns about the way that people often study American politics, is that they're looking only, say, at the media or Congress or the presidency or a single institution, and they spend less time trying to think about how these pieces connect and what's unusual about the way politics works in the United States compared with other countries. And comparative politics kind of encourages you to think about those bigger questions.
And I guess that you're suggesting that you really have to do language and the history of other places as part of this work to do comparative studies? Well,
sure. I think anybody who is working at scholarship realizes that you need to dig into something to really understand it, and that you can't just coast along the surface. And that's especially true when you're studying situations that are different from the ones that you've been exposed to and that you're most familiar with. So yes, you've got to make a big investment, I think, to really have any chance of having a good feel for another country.
Now, one of your first books, which I will show our audience, is Dismantling the Welfare State: Reagan, Thatcher, and the Politics of Retrenchment. How does this work kind of prove your point? So let's try to understand that problem by asking you, what was the problem here in this work that you were trying to understand?
Well, this book came out of my dissertation, and the background to it, at least interesting to me in retrospect, is, again, you can see if you're starting now, you can see the threads going back, but it happens in a more accidental, serendipitous way as you're moving forward. I was actually in Britain working on a different topic. I was interested in labor parties in Britain, and I was going to look at a couple of other cases in the continent. But I was there in the mid-1980s, which was really the height of Margaret Thatcher's rule in Britain. It was right when the miners' strike, the famous miners' strike, was going on, which was an incredibly bitter conflict that polarized Britons in a way that I think few political incidents of the last 3 or 4 decades have. And it was so interesting to be there at that time that I felt like I really needed to try to understand something about this phenomenon of a truly radical reformer, a conservative reformer in office, and the kind of political upheavals that was giving rise to, and how she was trying to achieve the goals that she had set for herself. And then, of course, it became quite natural, given the way I got an interest in comparative politics, to contrast her experience with Reagan's. And the core puzzle in the book, and again, I think we'll get to talking about off-center later, but there's a thread that connects what I was doing in that book to the current book. The core thing that I was trying to wrestle with in the book about Reagan and Thatcher was, how could they pursue policies that were pretty clearly unpopular? Not everything they wanted to do was unpopular, of course, but what they wanted to do to the welfare state was broadly unpopular. Most people, even if they had criticisms about social programs, they really didn't want to see them cut or dismantled, as I put it. And so that creates a particular political challenge for a leader who wants to pursue an agenda where important elements of it are not popular.
And we will, as you said, pick this up later, but some of the themes that are in the book emerge later. The insights that you gathered, I think, empowered you to have insights about what's going on in the United States today. And the end result is that you found the basis for which that the revolution didn't sweep everything aside in either the United States or in Great Britain, and there were differences as to why that happened.
Right. the core argument of the book, which I think broadly has been pretty well accepted, is that neither Reagan or Thatcher really succeeded, although there was a lot of hue and cry around the time, neither of them really succeeded in fundamentally changing the structure of social policy because of the kind of political challenges that they faced in doing that, and the fact that when they were very aggressive about it, there tended to be a pretty strong popular outcry. So in the United States, for example, Reagan's elected begins to talk about cuts in Social Security, and there's such a strong outcry against it that it plays an important role in the fact that Republicans lost 26 seats in the 1982 midterm elections, and that pretty much ended the conversation of a radical reform of Social Security.
And one of the variables there was the fact that a trust fund existed, right? Didn't that, because one of the themes that emerges again and again in your work is, well, what are the institutions that are in place? How did they come to be? And how do they then affect the different policies that you can design?
Yeah, the book, that's a good question. The book, in addition to saying, on the whole, they didn't change as much as a lot of people thought that they had or thought that they would be able to change, I'm also interested in understanding why some things are easier to change than others and what kinds of strategies are more or less successful. And one central factor is what's the particular structure of the situation that they inherit, having to do with a particular public policy. So in the case of pensions, social insurance, Thatcher was able to do much more than Reagan was able to do because there were particular features, including the trust fund, which put some limits on the kinds of changes that Reagan could introduce without producing a political outcry. And in that particular case, Thatcher had more room to maneuver.
Mm-hmm. Now, your second book is called Politics and Time, and I'm going to show that book to your audience. It's very lucid and clearly written, I must say, and it strikes me that in the debate between quantitative methods and looking at the history and society in time, so to speak, you really come down strongly in seeing the complexity of institutions, and that's what you're arguing about. Talk a little about why time is important. At one point you say it's a difference if you were analyzing a particular policy or a political event, it's an argument about a snapshot versus a moving picture. What did you mean by that?
Well, this is really was a book of social theory. It's not a book about any particular thing that's going on in the world, but more about the way that social scientists try to make sense of what's going on in the world. And it was my effort to wrestle with what I see, and I think many others see, as a long-term trend towards sort of marginalizing the role of historical analysis in the way that social science is conducted. And one sees that probably most clearly in the case of certain branches of economics and the way that that has spilled over into disciplines like political science and sociology, sometimes called rational choice theory, which really uses game theory and kind of the strategic interaction among particular individuals or particular groups as the basic raw material for studying social phenomena. And some of that also shows up, as you say, in quantitative analysis, where particular units, we measure indicators of particular units at a particular moment in time and run them through a statistical analysis to come to some kind of conclusion about what is going on. And the argument that I develop in the book is that both these approaches, at least if they're not done very carefully, tend to produce what I call a snapshot rather than a moving picture view of the social world, when in fact all social processes are historical processes. They're processes that take place in time and through time, and that if we ignore that, and as I said, just take a snapshot, in many cases we'll get quite a distorted view of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. You, in the conclusion to that book, you say, because the lack of explaining institutional outcomes is better framed as an issue of institutional development rather than one of institutional selection. And again, this is the idea that it's not just somebody picks democracy, but how have institutions developed over time to make democracy possible. And you go on, say, institutional development in turn cannot be adequately treated without attending to issues incorporating an extended time frame, you know, the historical context, including the role of time horizons, unintended consequences, learning and competitive selection, and path dependence.
Right. I start that chapter with a quote from Charles Tilly, who's a wonderful sociologist, who says that, you know, the building of democracy should be seen more like the construction of a village than the execution of a blueprint of a single building. And I think we have a tendency, some of this is echoed in current events, if we think about the kind of thinking about how societies operate and how one changes them. Some of the thinking, I think, that went into current events in Iraq reflect, I think, a very kind of short-termist view that simply says, okay, you can go in and sweep things away pretty quickly, and you put a clever design in place, and everything else will fall into place. And if we think about something like the American Constitution, to take it as a contrast, well, yes, there were founders, there were framers, and they wrote this document which profoundly affected the structure of the kind of political system that we operate in. But the building of American democracy has been a 2-century-long process, which in many respects, I mean, I think if the framers came back today, there's a lot that they wouldn't recognize and that they wouldn't be able to easily make sense of from the structure that they put in place 2 centuries ago. Sean Wilentz has a new book out on the construction of American democracy, which I think very nicely makes this point that it is a centuries-long process, not something that can be understood by looking at a particular moment.
Is this particularly an American disease of ahistoricism, or is it a more general phenomenon in the social sciences?
It's a good question. I mean, I have found European audiences to be very receptive
to what you're saying,
to the kinds of arguments that I'm making. So I think there is something to that. Though I think it's also it's a feature of what I would call a kind of technocratic turn in modern social science, which you see especially in the U.S., but you see it other places too. That I mentioned earlier, game theory and complex statistical analyses, which have become seen as the most scientific, most modern way to study social phenomena. And both of these techniques, I think, lend themselves to an ahistorical view of society. I'm not saying that they necessarily do, right? And that's something that I spent a lot of time wrestling with in the book, because I'm actually a great admirer of statistical analysis and of game theory properly employed, but I think they do have these tendencies if people are not thinking about the processes they're studying as being historical processes.
After looking at these first 2 books, one can really see how you landed at the book we're now going to talk about, which is called Off-Center, The Republican Revolution and the Erosion of American Democracy, which you co-authored with Jacob S. Hacker. And so I think that the first question really is what is the problem with American politics that you focused on?
Well, Jacob and I started out by trying to demonstrate 3 things that we think we are able to demonstrate clearly, and if one buys that part of the argument, then it raises a whole lot of issues about what's going on with American democracy. The first claim is that the Republican Party over the last 25 or 30 years has moved way to the right from where it was, and that's pretty easy to demonstrate. The second is that public opinion has not moved. And this, I think, is perhaps more surprising to people for reasons that we could talk about. I think a lot of people assume that if Republicans are running the country and they move way to the right, it must mean that public opinion has moved way to the right. But careful students, scholars of public opinion who try to study systematically how people answer particular questions that are asked over and over again and use that to generate measures of where the public is on the sort of left to right continuum. There are shifts. It's not that it's totally frozen, and you could probably guess particular periods where things are swinging slightly to the right or slightly to the left, but there's been no real movement over the last 30 years. So you put those two, I would say, facts together, that the Republican Party has moved way to the right, public opinion hasn't moved way to the right. Well, our conventional understandings of American politics suggest that should be a big problem for the Republican Party. They should be losing elections. All right? So the image that you get in your mind would be Barry Goldwater, right? Better to be right, and
not winning,
and not winning, right?
Yeah.
So. But then you get to our third fact, which again I think is hard to argue against. So I'd say it's a fact: is that Republicans have been quite successful. Right? They've clearly been successful in electoral terms. They're not winning big victories, but they're winning enough victories to keep themselves in power. And they've been pretty successful in pursuing an off-center agenda. Again, not completely successful, but pretty successful, and really puzzlingly successful given these first two facts.
And so the title, let me emphasize this, the title comes from off-center because the pride of American democracy is the middle, the center. Right.
There's both a kind of casual, conventional kind of understanding, which is that of course, swing voters, the majority, the people who help to create a majority are going to, they're the ones who are going to determine what government is going to do. And political scientists have developed very refined, technically sophisticated models that essentially produce that same finding. You're not supposed to be able to govern off-center. And again, by off-center, I don't just mean conservative, right? Because I'm not going to pretend that I would be ecstatic about a government that was pursuing conservative policies, but I think there's a big difference between a government pursuing conservative policies when there's clear public support for those policies. That I wouldn't call that off-center, I would call that conservative. By off-center, we mean that there is a disconnect between where public opinion seems to be and where public authority seems to be headed. And that's why the subtitle of the book is The Erosion of American Democracy. It's not just because liberals object to what the conservative majority might be doing, but because it seems to reflect kind of a breakdown of responsiveness and accountability.
The book is really quite insightful in helping us understand how this new system works. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But first I want to set the stage here, because having looked at your books and our conversation here has pointed to, well, let's ask, what's the institutional setting? How did we come to this point? So let's take a few moments to look in my outline. I say at the structure and the setting. What sort of things have happened across the board that set the stage? As we know, after having talked earlier, we have to look at the history here. What has happened that should be the prelude before we get into the analysis?
It's a great question, and I think there are a lot of elements that we could talk about, but you're hitting on one of the key efforts of the book, which is to emphasize to people that this is not just a story of particular personalities, or even of one set of actors who are more clever, than their opponents. But it's something that has deeper roots that are built into some of the major shifts that have been taking place in the contours of American society, and that needs to be understood in more structural terms rather than in the kind of the highly individualized, personality-driven terms that is often what the media chooses to focus on. But let me mention a couple that are that I think you'd want to put front and center. One is the rise of inequality in American society over the last 30 years. There has been an enormous increase in inequality in American society, and it's not an inequality in the sense that the top third has more and the bottom third has less. The really important shifts in resources have been from the bottom 95% to the top 1%. and the 4% in between are kind of holding their relative position. But it's been the increase in inequality has been highly concentrated at the top end. I mean, really to an astonishing degree that I don't think people fully recognize. And at the same time that that's been going on, money's been becoming much more important in American politics. Campaigns are becoming incredibly expensive, media-driven, and mounting a credible challenge in an election requires enormous amounts of money. So you put those two things together, and that's a very important structural change. And then the other, I think, big structural change that I would want to emphasize at the beginning of this part of the conversation is the realignment of American politics in the place of the South in American politics, whereas traditionally the South was Democratic and created a kind of majority Democratic Party that had this odd coalition between quite conservative Democrats in the South and more liberal Democrats in other parts of the country, to a situation where the South is now overwhelmingly Republican and the most conservative and leading edge politically of the conservative movement in the country. That's just a profoundly important change that obviously has been a major contributor to the remaking of the Republican Party.
Now, when we were talking about your book on Thatcher and Reagan, you mentioned that how the changing atmosphere there had affected the change in your topic, and I would also like for you to help us understand the emergence of this conservative network over this period from, I guess, the time of Nixon and definitely through Reagan, who gives it a new push and so on. So, but there are a number of things that are going on here that also help set the stage. Talk a little about historically why you think that has come about over and above the political mechanisms that you talk about in your book. There's a historical trend here, I guess.
There is a clear historical trend, and in the book we focus on, I don't know if I'll say the culmination of the trend because we don't know what's going to come next, but the fruition at least of this transformation of the Republican Party. So the period that we focus on in the book, and I have to say that the book is not, given the one that I wrote before, this book is not deeply historical. I mean, it does try to draw out some of these big long-term structural transformations, but the focus is on understanding the contemporary period and the way that this new Republican government operates. We wanted the book to be accessible to a general audience, and we thought an extra 100 pages about the evolution of the conservative movement would not do that for most people. But it is clear that there was a long-term development of a movement that was much more conservative than the older Republican Party that it replaced. And a lot of that has to do with the Southern transformation, and the Reagan years as being a catalyst to that. But even the Congressional Republican Party of the Reagan years was far more moderate than the party that exists today. And let me just give you one quick example that I think illustrates that in a telling way. If you look at the Republican House delegation in 1985, there were, I think, roughly 190 Republicans in the House at that point. And every year the American Conservative Union does a voting score where they give people they keep track of who they think has the right voting record. And there are many groups that do this. The ACU does it for essentially measuring who's a devoted conservative. And there were only 8 Republicans out of the 190 who received perfect 100 scores from the American Conservative Union. 2 of those 8 from 20 years ago are people who are now pretty prominent in American politics. One is Dick Cheney, and a second is Tom DeLay. So two of the 4 or 5, with DeLay now has obviously lost his role, but if you're thinking 6 months back, 2 of the 4 or 5 most powerful people in the United States were the very far right edge, extreme edge of the Republican Party in Congress only 20 years ago.
How important in this historical context is this American ideology about the way things work in America. It's obviously something we see in our efforts to transform the world, a kind of notion about the importance of the individual and free enterprise and so on. Does this also part of setting the stage for what you later talk about as a tool of obfuscation?
That's a good question. It's a hard one to give a short answer to. I mean, I do want to emphasize that we do not believe, this is why the second fact that I mentioned, that public opinion has not swung to the right. We do not believe that the key to Republican success is that it has persuaded people of its worldview. Right? That just doesn't show up. I mean, there are lots of conservatives in the country. There are more conservatives than there are liberals. But there are far more liberals and moderates than there are conservatives. And it's just not the case that moderates have been persuaded to adopt these kinds of views. But it is true that individualism runs deep in American political culture, and that if matters can be framed in ways that help to get people thinking along those lines, well, that's powerful politically. And there are definitely strategies that Republicans have developed which are designed to try to activate that kind of focus on individualism. So one example that we think is central would be the discussion about tax cuts in the United States, which has been central to the Republican agenda. The Republicans have not been successful because they've convinced people to prefer tax cuts to other possible ways of using a government surplus, which we had in 2001. But they have succeeded in making sure that most of the conversation is about tax cuts and not about these other things. So they've controlled the agenda in a way that essentially says to people, would you like a tax cut? And if the agenda is controlled and the question is framed that way, then it does tap these kind of individualist sentiments that you're talking about.
Now, in the welfare book, you had talked a lot about this whole question of institutional setting and the design of policy, which is now, as we come into, well, what is it they've done and how are they doing? That's really an important issue, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's affected the kind of terrain on which they've tried to pursue their agenda. And of course, the big shift here has been the relentless focus on tax cuts as the main entering wedge for changing the character of domestic policy. And it was really, if you want to think about the roots of this book, it was Jacob and I sitting down in 2001 and pondering the first round of Bush tax cuts and the magnitude of what they were able to achieve in that legislation without any seeming public groundswell in support of it. That got us interested in working on this book. And it's also just a tremendously important example of the way in which details of legislation and the structuring of legislation are being used to facilitate an off-center agenda.
And in the case of the tax bill, and I was pleasantly surprised to see some of this actually in the welfare book, in the sense that, well, how do you design a policy? Talk a little about that, because they're all the different things that an empowered, very right-wing group who have taken control of the Congress can do to frame legislation, so which leads to a situation where the voter generally doesn't know what's going on.
Right. So I think it's important to just set the stage that in 2000 and 2001, there was no evidence in public opinion polls that people were chomping at the bit for a big tax cut. It's actually quite different. I think in 1980, you can make a totally legitimate case to say that Ronald Reagan ran on a platform of tax cuts. It was identified as a central issue by voters. He won a clear majority in the election, and he had a mandate to cut taxes. Much harder to make that case for Bush. There's nothing in public opinion polls that suggested that people wanted a big tax cut, and in fact, if you asked people, again, the backdrop for this was that there was a large budget surplus and projected budget surplus in 2001. The question was really how to spend it, what combination of things to do with those resources. And if you asked people that question, which was asked repeatedly in polls, overwhelmingly people placed a low priority on tax cuts, higher priority on reducing the debt, on Social Security, shoring up Social Security and Medicare, other government programs. And it's clear that the White House knew this. We, in the course of our research, found a memo from inside the White House that stated flat out the public prefers spending on education and health care to tax cuts. So what do? We need to make sure that people don't see the trade-offs. Right, that we can present tax cuts in a way that look like they're going to be affordable and are not going to interfere with all these other priorities, even though they knew that they were going to be much more expensive. And so you can do a lot by designing legislation in ways that both make the legislation look less expensive than it's going to be, and also make it look like it's distributed much more towards average voters than it actually is going to be. The first challenge, which Bill Thomas, who's the head of the House Ways and Means Committee, described as the goal of putting 1.5 pounds of sugar in a 1 pound bag. So how do we get as many tax cuts in here as we can while convincing people that we're not going to be busting the budget? And you do that by using phase-ins and sunsets and various other gimmicks that we talk about that made the tax cut. They're very peculiar from a public policy point of view, why you would have things phasing in and phasing out over periods of 10 years. Nobody had ever done it this way before. It really was a new technique for doing budget policy, certainly on this scale. But it had the effect of being able to pretend that the tax cuts were going to be much smaller than they were. And then distributionally, how do you make things look like the average voter is doing better than in fact they're doing? And a central technique for doing that is to give regular voters, average income voters, a tax cut immediately and phase in tax cuts for the well-to-do much more gradually. And we have, I think, a powerful chart. If charts can be powerful in the book, there's a powerful chart that shows over time, so the time element again, how the benefits of the 2001 tax cuts are distributed. In the first year, the majority of the benefits go to average income households. Everybody got a letter from the president and Congress with a nice check right there within weeks after the legislation passed. But over time, the percentage of the benefits from the bill that are going to the well-to-do is growing, and the percentage that's going to the less well-to-do is going down, so that by the 10th year of the tax bill, over 50% of the benefits are going to the top 1%.
And this is a very sophisticated strategy for achieving goals, to the extent that they're even building into the long term a future coalition to keep these major tax cuts going, even though there's a sunset provision.
Right. So legislative design is central to the way that this political coalition works. There's a strong tendency among political analysts, and here I don't just mean journalists, but people who follow politics for a living, to not pay much attention to these kind of details of legislation. People find it boring for the most part. But it's profoundly important, and it's not just because it allows you to steer goodies towards the people you want to steer goodies to without other people noticing it. It can also be a mechanism, as you say, for building up your coalition and for setting the agenda for the future, so that these tax cuts are scheduled to expire at a certain point. Well, that gives you an opportunity to rally your troops and also to accuse your opponents of voting in favor of tax increases, even though you're the ones who wrote the legislation that produces that tax increase.
And there is also a very sophisticated use of the rules of the institution, in this case the Congress, to make things happen that is an important element of this. Talk a little about that, conference committees and the time allowed on the legislative floor to debate a bill.
Right. We spend a fair amount of time talking about legislative procedure, and again, it's one of the challenges in this book, but it captures an important political reality, is that the devil is really in the details. And that's one of the I would say elements of political genius in this new majority coalition that's been constructed, because they recognize that most people, their eyes are going to glaze over when they start hearing about things like this, and that creates an opportunity. I mean, I've been saying to people, when you feel your eyes starting to glaze over because somebody is talking about the alternative minimum tax or a conference committee, then reach to cover your wallet, because that's when somebody is reaching in there and trying to get at it, because these elements of procedure are really very powerful. And they've allowed Republicans to do two things that I think are important. One is it provides opportunities to push legislation well to the right without that getting a lot of attention. So conference committees are set up when the House and Senate both pass a bill, but there's disagreement about the precise content of it. And traditionally, this has been a venue for essentially just working out the differences between the House and the Senate, and typically it's wherever there's less support for change, whichever chamber has less support for change, they're likely to get their way because they're more likely to block the bill, and so that's how that traditionally would have worked out, but it's not the way that it works out now. The way that it tends to work out now, and actually a colleague of mine here, Rob Van Houweling, has done excellent research on this, which we rely on, that shows that Republicans are using conference committees to rewrite legislation in a really fundamental way, and typically push it well to the right, because they know that then when they bring it back to the House and the Senate, there are no amendments allowed. Right? It's simply an up or down vote on that legislation. Very conservative elements are being added in conference committees, and Democrats are completely excluded from the actual meetings where these decisions are being made, or occasionally, one or two Democrats who are willing to play ball will be brought in, but everybody else is excluded. And then they bring bills with an attractive label, like tax cuts or prescription drug benefit, but that are packaged with all sorts of red meat for the Republican base. They bring those back to the floor where you can make no amendments, and they use that as a way to push policy off center.
You're suggesting here, as we move now to talk a little about this, what you call backlash insurance. But overall, what you're saying is that the Republicans, or this group, the subgroup of Republicans, has managed to create a nationalized structure of power that allows them not to worry about the middle-of-the-road voter, those swing voters that kept the ship of state on a middle course. Talk a little about how these things come together in backlash insurance, which leads to a situation where they don't worry about losing elections.
Well, there are two big points there, and maybe I'll talk first about this unity, and then we could talk a little bit about the backlash insurance, which is essentially a product. You can't produce the backlash insurance unless you get this kind of unity. And this is a new phenomenon in American politics, that we have an ideologically committed but quite unified, and not totally unified, but unprecedentedly unified national party. It's more like a European parliamentary party where people march in lockstep than what Americans are used to, which is parties being kind of these soft coalitions that are constantly shifting, and where there are lots of things that are bipartisan, or where some faction within the party joins with the other party over something. That just doesn't happen in American politics today the same way, and it is because the party has become so much more unified, so much more coordinated, and you can see that in a whole range of behaviors. And a lot of it is driven by the fact that most of these people don't have to worry about re-election. They're very conservative, and yet they're either in safe seats, or they can draw on these techniques that have been developed to protect them from potential backlash.
And so you talk a little about a moderate Republican Congresswoman from New Jersey, I believe,
yes,
and how she faced a threat. Talk a little about that, because it shows what is the process here that is making this happen, and that it's really control within the Republican Party that we're talking about.
Right. We think moderates in the Republican Party are really in quite a weak position, and that even when they seem to be playing a more powerful role, it's often a matter of theater where the leadership has found an opportunity to give them a place where they can stake out some independence, or put a little daylight between them and the leadership, which plays well in their own district. But it's mostly for show or else on something that's quite marginal to the core agenda of the leadership. So moderates are playing this weak role, and we track the career of Marge Rockema, who was a moderate Republican from New Jersey, and both the way in which she was pushed out of opportunities to have access and influence within the Republican majority because she was too moderate, wasn't raising enough money from the big interests for the party, and faced primary challenges from the right. And then eventually, a critical part of that story for us is that she's replaced when she finally quits. After having just barely beaten back a couple of primary challenges, she's replaced by Scott Garrett, who is one of the people who'd been challenging her, who is way to the right. Even though her district is a pretty moderate district, Garrett is a very, very conservative figure, much more in keeping with this new Republican Party.
At one point, you suggest that the notion out there is that the lobbyists are controlling the agenda, and you're arguing that what has developed with this control by the national Republican Party, which in turn is controlled by this very radical right faction within the party, that you have a situation where the terms are being dictated by the political leadership and not vice versa. The lobbyists are not calling the two. They are paying protection money, which helps get people elected, which then implements agenda where they will get some goodies. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's you're maybe putting it a little bit more strongly than I would, but it certainly captures the essence of it. Access to power, to authority, is what politicians can offer interest groups. And access has become much more centralized in the new political system. And we're seeing some of this in the scandals that are emerging right now. It's interesting when you start connecting the dots to see how many of them connect to very powerful people. I mean, some of the more obscure members who are being targeted at the moment, but it's clear that right behind them are strong connections to the leadership. Because the system has become much more networked, and you have to get access to these leaders in order to have influence, because they do control the agenda so effectively, and they can get the members to go along with most of the things that they want to do. Now, the reason why I say that it doesn't quite turn things on its head, it isn't just that Tom DeLay or whoever replaces Tom DeLay can call the shots and the interest groups do whatever they want, is because it's an arrangement that I think works pretty well for both sides. Of
both
the bargain.
Sides, meaning
the groups,
yeah.
The groups who are providing resources, and the politicians, right? So that I would say that, and again, this is putting it a little bit too simplistically, but it captures the kind of the shift. The deal that is being offered is, you be loyal to us. Don't hold out for the best deal. Don't try to cut a separate deal with some subcommittee chairperson or somebody in the other chamber. You work with us, and you be loyal to us, and we'll make sure that you'll be taken care of. All right? So provide support up front. Don't argue with us about details, and we'll make sure that your interests are protected in the legislation. And if you look at the way the prescription drug bill, for example, worked, you had lots of powerful interests who signed on at the very beginning. It was totally different than what happened when the Clinton administration tried to advance healthcare initiatives, where almost all the interest groups played hard to get, right? Because that was the way that you got some kind of a benefit. But the system now has become much more centralized, much more coordinated, and much more with a lot of the powerful interests, at least the ones that are close to the GOP, working hand in hand with the leadership.
Now, what is the goal here? Is this about power, the consolidation of power, or is it about power and money?
Well, it's another good question, and I think we try to resist the effort to get inside people's heads and figure out what is ultimately motivating them. I think in many cases, multiple motivations reinforce each other. People want some of these figures. They want power. They want particular conservative agenda to be advanced to an extent that I think maybe we didn't fully realize when we were writing it. Personal enrichment is also a goal for many of the participants, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it makes sense to. I think it's very difficult to figure out exactly what the mix is for any individual, much less for the coalition as a whole. And again, I think one of the beauties of the system, from their point of view, is that they've been able to get these things to all work together, so that the figures involved don't face a trade-off all the time. This used to be the old view, was that politicians face a trade-off between pursuing their policy goals and protecting their careers. Right? Because if you were too aggressive, if your policy goals didn't match up with voters and you were too aggressive about doing that, you'd lose your career. All right? So the genius of the new arrangement is to say you can have your cake and eat it too. You can pursue those aggressive policy goals, even off-center ones. Not all of them. They weren't able to privatize Social Security, but they've been able to do a lot. And your career will be just fine.
So does your analysis offer us insight into how we can reform things?
Well, Jacob and I try to break that down into two pieces. It's obviously the question that leaps out at you by the time you get to the end of what I think for many people is a discouraging, disillusioning book. And we break it down into two pieces. We say we need to think about what kinds of reforms would make the system work in a way that was more responsive, more accountable. And we need to think about what kinds of circumstances might bring those reforms into being. Right? And the first part, we actually think there are a lot of interesting issues that one could talk about there, but it's not that hard to come up with a list of reforms that would make a difference. And we talk about changes that would make elections more competitive, changes that would increase voter turnout, and therefore empower average voters, make them a more important part of the process, changes that would increase transparency in the political system, make it easier for people to see what's going on. So the problem is not I don't think it's a problem of political engineering. It's not that we don't have ideas about what could create a system that was more empowering for ordinary voters and increase transparency within the political process. So there are lots of interesting questions about the best way to achieve that. The bigger challenge is the political challenge that precedes that. How do you create a context in which these kinds of reforms are possible?
One other question that comes to mind after having looked at the timing, the book on time, and that is what is going on in the world, the greater world. And you, at one point, I can't remember, it was about the building of the state and how it was affected by the balance of power in the world. You were looking at a particular book, and I'm curious, how does 9/11 fit into this? You do not discuss this in the book, but it would seem that if we focus in this snapshot on this moment in time, that there was some leverage that came from the events that related to terrorism and the events of 9/11? I
think that's unquestionably true. And we talk about it briefly in the book, but we don't focus on it. And the reason, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is we didn't feel like we had the qualifications to talk about it in a way that we were comfortable with. We didn't feel like we had knowledge in that realm that would allow us to do that in a way that we were comfortable with. But we also thought that there were a lot of other things going on beyond 9/11 that deserved attention. There's no question that the events of 9/11 and the events that followed from 9/11 greatly strengthened the political hand of the Bush administration in particular. And that those political resources have been used to give them a cushion, if you will, that allows them to do some things that would not have been so easy to do otherwise. And one could argue, we'll never know, but if one asked, I talk in the Time book about the importance of asking counterfactuals and doing historical analysis. What would have happened to the Bush administration if there had been no 9/11? He wasn't very popular at that point in his term, and one can argue, maybe he would have been a one-term president. But there are several reasons that we outline at the beginning of the book for why we don't think 9/11 provides a full explanation, anything like a full explanation for what's been going on. The first is that a lot of these things preceded 9/11. Mm-hmm. The tax cuts preceded 9/11. The impeachment saga, which is, I think, quite important example of off-center politics.
The impeachment of President Clinton.
The impeachment of President Clinton, which it's very clear public opinion did not favor. Public opinion had settled strongly on a way to resolve that clash, which was a vote of censure. And Republicans were quite aggressive on the issue and simply refused to allow, this is an example of agenda control, they refused to allow a vote of censure to come to the floor of the House. And they instead pursued a different course, which every poll showed was not what the American public wanted. So there are lots of examples that are that predate 9/11. And we do think that the roots of this don't just start in the White House, and they begin well before 2001. And then the other, I think, important thing to say about 2001 is that there have been lots of foreign policy crises and wars in American political history, but there are fewer that actually provide huge, enduring benefits for a political party, and that extend beyond the president to Congress and extend beyond foreign policy to domestic policy. If you think about the Vietnam War or Korea or World War II, it's not clear that in any of those cases did you see this kind of, I mean, there's clear that chief executives benefited in some ways from the rally around the flag effect, but it didn't seem to carry over very much to Congress or to domestic politics. So I think it's too simple, it would be too simple to say it's 9/11 that has facilitated all this, made it possible.
One final question requiring a brief answer. How would you advise students to prepare for the future, to get a handle on problems like this, whether as an analyst, say as a political scientist, or as an activist, somebody who wants to change the system?
Well, I think a core is a big question, but obviously the Time book suggests that trying to put things into some kind of broader historical context is quite important, and gaining some kind of comparative perspective on things is important. I think a core argument in the more recent book is that knowledge is incredibly valuable, that information is a crucial resource in politics, and that if people can hide information or distort the presentation of information or the flow of information about what they're up to, especially in the modern world, which is just unbelievably complicated. The world has become more interdependent, more complex. The role of government has become larger and more complex. There is simply no substitute for informing oneself about the inner workings of that system, including things which might at first light seem pretty boring.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Paul, on that note, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come and be on our program. And thank you very much for writing the book with your co-author, Jacob S. Hacker. And I will show the book one more time and recommend it. And you said at one point that you wanted to write it for a public audience. And I think you've really done that. It's very clear and lucid and compelling in argument. So thanks very much.
Harry.
Thank you. And thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.